December 2009. Josh Powell said he drove two toddlers into freezing Utah darkness after midnight to camp, while Susan stayed home. The house would tell a colder story. Susan Cox Powell was expected at work in West Valley City that December morning, and when she never arrived, worry moved fast. Her home should have offered simple answers. Instead, it raised harder ones. Josh Powell was gone too, along with their two young sons, and his explanation would become the first fracture in the case. When Susan did not show up, the first fears were ordinary ones. Maybe there had been an accident. Maybe she was sick, stranded, or unable to reach anyone. Then police heard Josh Powell's account, and the case turned in a stranger direction. He said that after midnight, with winter temperatures dangerously low, he had taken Charles and Braden camping. Susan, he said, had remained at home. That explanation did not settle the room. It sharpened it. What father drives into the cold with two little boys while their mother stays behind in a quiet house? And when investigators stepped inside that house, the story did not soften. Susan's purse was there. Her phone was there. The small items that connect a person to the outside world had not gone with her. By then, the question was no longer only where Susan had gone. It was why the account around her absence already felt thin, practiced, and impossible to warm. This case has to be handled carefully. Rumor is not evidence, and suspicion is not proof. So we are going to stay with the record and move through the pieces that investigators could actually see. Josh Powell's late-night camping account, the condition of the home, and the belongings Susan left behind. We will also look at what the record said about life inside the marriage, because a missing person case can change when the private history begins to surface. The details do not have to shout to matter. A phone on a counter, a purse still in the house, a carpet being dried while a woman is gone. Each one asks for context, and the context did not stop with Josh. As the search widened, attention also moved toward his father, Stephen Powell, whose presence in the record made the family story feel more suffocating. By the end of this first part, the question is not whether the case felt suspicious. It clearly did. The harder question is which warning signs were already visible, and whether anyone understood what they meant as the search began. The first real disturbance was not outside in the snow. It was inside the house. Missing person cases often begin with a gap in the day, a desk waiting at work, a phone that rings until it gives up, or a family member who cannot explain why someone is late. But in Susan's home, the absence had details attached to it. Her purse had not gone with her. Her phone had not gone with her. Those are small facts, but they matter because most adults do not leave their link to the world behind by accident. Then there was the carpet. Investigators found fans drying a wet area, the kind of household detail that might mean nothing in another case. It could have been a spill, a leak, or a rushed cleaning job. On its own, it does not prove what happened to Susan. That is exactly why it lingers. It sits there, unresolved, while Josh's account asks everyone to believe he was away camping with two young children in the middle of a freezing night. Why would the home need drying at that same moment? Why would Susan's everyday belongings remain inside if she had left freely? The house did not feel like the starting point of a normal departure. It felt like a place where something had been interrupted, and then someone tried to put the room back together. The disturbance was quiet. It was the mismatch between a missing mother and a home that seemed to be cleaning up after something. Josh's answer had a strange power because it did not need to be complicated to sound wrong. The plain version was troubling enough. He said he left after midnight, drove into freezing weather, brought two little boys with him, and went camping while Susan stayed home. If he had offered a routine errand or a sudden family emergency, the first hours might have unfolded differently. Instead, every piece of the account pushed people back toward the same question. Why that night? Why that hour? And why with the children? Then the record around the marriage began to matter. It described a relationship marked by control, surveillance, and fear. Those words should not be treated as background noise. Control is not a bad mood. Surveillance is not ordinary concern. Fear is not normal conflict between spouses. Together, they point to a home where one person's freedom may have been narrowing long before anyone called police. And the circle did not stop with Josh. As attention moved through the family, Stephen Powell, Josh's father, became part of the record because of his fixation on Susan. That fact does not solve the disappearance. It does, however, change the atmosphere around it. Susan was a missing mother inside a family story where documented behavior made the silence around her feel much more dangerous. West Valley City matters here because it changes the way Josh's account lands. This was not a remote wilderness outpost where winter camping might seem ordinary. It was a populated Utah community built around work shifts, school mornings, grocery runs, and families trying to get through December cold. And that cold was not cinematic. It was the kind that bites through a jacket while you scrape a windshield and makes parents think twice before taking small children outside for long. But here is the part that resets the whole story. The alleged trip did not merely sound inconvenient. It sounded backwards. Camping can be harmless when it is planned, supplied, and done for a reason. After midnight, in freezing weather, with toddlers in the car, it becomes something else entirely. It asks everyone to accept risk as routine. That context strips away the soft edges. This was not a quirky family outing being judged harshly after the fact. This was a missing woman, a home with troubling details, and an explanation that depended on the cold being treated like background noise. In this case, winter was not scenery. It was a pressure test, and the account began to strain the moment you stopped hearing the word camping and started feeling the temperature. Once the camping account entered the record, the case stopped being a simple question of where Susan had gone. It became a question about how people respond when fear is visible, but proof is still incomplete. Susan was a 28-year-old mother whose ordinary life had suddenly been converted into timelines, police statements, and conversations about what her husband knew. Charles and Braden were caught inside that storm, with no control over it. They were children, carried through adult decisions, adult explanations, and adult risks. Here is the dilemma that runs under the whole case. When warning signs are this disturbing, how far should a system be allowed to go before it has final proof? Move too slowly, and danger keeps its privacy. Move too quickly, and the power meant to protect people can harm the wrong person. That is why this case is so hard to talk about responsibly. Suspicion matters, but suspicion is not enough. Documentation matters, but documentation can arrive in pieces. If you follow careful investigations like this, subscribe and stay with us, because we are going to keep separating what is known from what is only suspected. The point is not shock. The point is how danger can hide inside ordinary family language until a person disappears, and the people with the least power are left inside the unanswered questions. The hardest cases are the ones that refuse to give up a clean answer. Susan's purse and phone being left behind raised serious doubts about a voluntary disappearance, but those items could not explain what happened next. Fans drying a wet carpet were alarming in that house at that moment, but a wet carpet can have ordinary causes. Josh's camping account sounded almost impossible to accept, but even a strange account is not the same as a complete case. That is where honesty matters. If every suspicious detail is treated as proof, the story becomes easier than the evidence allows. If every detail is brushed aside because someone can offer an innocent explanation, the danger disappears into technicalities. The truth sits in the pattern, and patterns take patience. In those first hours, investigators had to weigh facts that pointed in the same unsettling direction, without pretending they had already reached the end. There was the midnight trip. There were the belongings left at home. There was the wet carpet. There was the record of control and fear inside the marriage. Each piece could be argued over. Together, they made the explanation harder to carry. Certainty did not arrive quickly in this case. Contradiction arrived first, and contradiction is how dangerous stories survive. The connection that changes the case is not a hidden object or one dramatic discovery. It is the link between Susan's absence and the two children Josh said he took with him into the cold. At first, Charles and Braden could seem to make his story less suspicious. Why would a father bring toddlers along if he were doing something he needed to hide? But the same question can turn in the other direction. Why were the only other people on that trip too young to explain the night in any clear adult way? That is the chilling hinge. The boys were not background details in Josh's account. They were the living pieces of the timeline, carried through the version of events everyone was being asked to accept. They could not give full statements. They could not challenge an adult's clock, route, or reason for leaving. They could only remember in fragments, if they remembered at all. I am genuinely curious about this part. Would the boys' presence make you less suspicious of Josh's story, or more suspicious? Tell me in the comments. Because in a family record already marked by control, surveillance, and Stephen Powell's fixation on Susan, information mattered. If the purse, the phone, the wet carpet, and the camping trip were connected, the boys were not outside that connection. They were near the center of it. Now go back to the beginning and let the facts land in a different order. Do not start with Josh as a worried husband offering an unusual explanation. Start with Susan as a woman whose marriage had already been described through control, surveillance, and fear. Start with the house, where her purse and phone remained after she vanished. Start with the fans drying a wet patch of carpet. Then add the after-midnight camping account, the freezing weather, and two little boys who could not speak for themselves in any adult sense. The same facts feel different when the pattern is visible. The purse is harder to treat as a simple forgotten item. The phone is harder to treat as a minor inconvenience. The trip is harder to treat as odd timing. Stephen Powell's documented fixation on Susan does not prove what happened to her, and we should be careful about that. But it does reveal the atmosphere around her, a family atmosphere where boundaries had already been crossed in disturbing ways. That is the re-examination this case demands. It asks us to stop treating each warning sign as if it lived alone. One detail can be dismissed. Two details can be explained away. But when every explanation requires you to step around the next unsettling fact, coincidence starts to look less convincing. As the search widened, the center of the case began to shift. The first question was direct: where is Susan Powell? But the deeper investigators looked, the more that question opened into others. What had Susan been living inside before she disappeared? What did Josh know that no one else knew? What did Charles and Braden see, hear, or carry with them from that freezing night? And why did the men around Susan keep becoming part of the record? The evidence did not form a neat staircase. It came in separate pieces, and each piece made the next one harder to ignore. There was a missing phone. There was a purse left behind. There was a wet carpet being dried while Susan was gone. There was a marriage described through control, surveillance, and fear. Then Stephen Powell's fixation added another layer of violation to an already suffocating family picture. None of that brings Susan home. None of it gives investigators the full answer. But together, those facts made a simple disappearance harder and harder to believe. If you are following this investigation, subscribe and stay with us as we keep moving through the record carefully. By this point, hope was becoming harder to hold. A mother had vanished without the things she would normally carry. Her husband had offered an explanation that strained under the cold, the hour, and the children. And the people closest to the last known version of that night were still the people with the smallest voices. Susan Powell's case does not turn on one secret suddenly sliding into place. The revelation is colder than that. It comes when all the separate discomforts stop looking separate. Josh's after-midnight camping trip stops being only strange timing. It becomes a wall in the story, keeping everyone focused on where he claimed to be instead of what may have happened before he left. Susan's purse and phone stop reading as forgotten items on a counter. They are signs that she did not leave her life in any normal way. The fans and wet carpet stop looking like small household oddities. They raise the harder question of what someone might have been trying to dry, explain, or make look ordinary again. Then the marriage record changes the center of gravity. Control, surveillance, and fear are not background details. They are the conditions that can isolate a person before the outside world understands the danger. Stephen Powell's fixation on Susan adds another violation to that picture. It does not answer the question of where Susan went, but it shows how often her boundaries had already been crossed. And then there are Charles and Braden. The boys in the snow are more than the shocking image inside Josh's statement. They are the fragile human link between the night Susan vanished and the future of the investigation. They were too young to command a room. They were not too young to matter. Once that settles in, the case stops feeling like a mystery that simply refused to resolve. It feels like a warning that kept getting louder, while the people in danger became smaller and smaller. The worst part of the case arrives years later, and it is almost impossible to sit with because it falls on the children. By then, the story was no longer centered only on a missing mother or on a husband whose explanation never stopped sounding wrong. It was also about Charles and Braden, the two boys Josh said he carried into the freezing night. The children left inside a family story built around fear. During a supervised visit, the kind of visit that exists because adults had already recognized risk, Josh attacked and killed both of his sons. That fact turns the case inside out. Supervision is supposed to be the narrow bridge between danger and parental rights. It is meant to create a controlled space, a place where adults can say they know enough to be careful. Here, careful was not enough. What makes this so hard to absorb is how visible the boys' vulnerability had been. They had been there in the original strange account. They were tied to the question of what happened to Susan. They were living reminders that some truth might still surface one day, maybe in a memory, a question, or a child's unfinished sentence. Then they were gone too. That is why this case does not feel like an ordinary mystery with missing answers. It feels like a record of control spreading outward after Susan vanished. The people with the smallest voices were placed closest to the danger. The final horror is that Susan disappeared, and the last small witnesses were destroyed before they could grow old enough to tell anyone what they remembered. After the boys were killed, no one could honestly call the aftermath closure. Closure suggests a door shutting cleanly. It suggests a final page, or a grief that has somewhere to rest. This case left no such place. Susan was still missing. Charles and Braden were gone. The story that began with a mother failing to arrive at work had ended by taking the children, who might have carried the last fragments of that night, into adulthood. The consequences were moral as much as procedural. Looking back, the warning signs can be named almost too easily. The after-midnight camping account, the freezing weather, the belongings left at home, the wet carpet, the documented control, the surveillance, the fear, and Stephen Powell's obsession. But naming danger after the fact is not the same as stopping it while people are still alive. That is the wound this case leaves open. For the people who loved Susan and the boys, every answer came attached to another absence. There was no ordinary future to rebuild. There was no version of justice that could return a mother to her sons or return two children to the lives they should have had. What remained was a record and a warning. Danger often announces itself through details that do not look complete at first. Children can be pulled into adult violence long before anyone understands how close the end has become. Some crimes frighten us because they happen without warning. This one frightens us because so many pieces were visible. There was the strange explanation, the controlled marriage, the house that would not explain itself, and 2 children carried into the cold before they were left inside a danger. Adults were still trying to measure. The lesson is not that every warning sign tells the whole truth. It is that patterns deserve courage. Fear should be heard before it becomes evidence on a timeline. If this documentary made you see control, silence, and family loyalty differently, subscribe for more careful true crime storytelling. And remember Susan, Charles, and Braden as people, not symbols. Their story asks us to notice what others are trying not to see.